The Blackwood House Mystery, a detective's descent into madness. What happens when seasoned detectives encounter something that defies every law of nature they've sworn to uphold? This is the story of the Blackwood House, where reality itself became negotiable, where time folded in on itself, and where one man's search for truth led him into a nightmare that lasted 10 years? Or did it last only a single night? The conversation that changed everything. It was during one of those late autumn evenings, the kind where the air carries a bite that makes you grateful for the warmth of good company and stronger coffee, when my old friend Marcus finally told me the story. We'd known each other for years, ever since college, but I'd always sensed there was something he kept locked away, some dark corner of his past he refused to illuminate. Marcus had been a detective for nearly 2 decades before retiring early, and that night, with the wind howling outside my apartment and rain drumming against the windows, he finally opened up. His hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around his coffee mug, and his eyes had that distant look of someone gazing into an abyss that had long ago gazed back into him. "You ever wonder," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "if everything you believed about reality was just wrong? Not metaphorically wrong, but fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong?" I didn't answer. Something in his tone told me this wasn't a question that needed a response. When I first joined the force, I was fresh out of the academy, full of idealism, convinced that every mystery had a logical explanation, that every case could be solved with enough legwork and forensic evidence. The old-timers at the precinct, they tried to warn me, especially about the Blackwood House case. He paused, taking a long sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving the dark liquid in his cup. They said some cases are better left closed. Some doors, once opened, can never be shut again. I wish to God I'd listened. What follows is the story Marcus told me that night. A story corroborated by case files that officially don't exist, by witnesses who later recanted their statements, and by one man's decade-long journey into a mystery that defied everything we think we know about the nature of reality itself. The house that time forgot. The Blackwood House stood on Riverside Drive, in a neighborhood that had seen better days even back in the early 1980s. It was a time when that part of the city was transitioning from residential to industrial, leaving behind scattered pockets of old homes that seemed out of place among the warehouses and vacant lots. According to property records, the house had been built in the 1920s by a wealthy industrialist named Theodore Blackwood, who'd made his fortune in steel before the Depression hit. When Blackwood lost everything in the crash of '29, he'd fled the country. Some said to Europe, others claimed South America. The house had sat empty for years before being purchased by the government and eventually rented out to low-income families. In the spring of 1983, a family of 4 moved into the Blackwood House. A man who went by the name Lincoln Hartfield, his wife Catherine, who walked with a pronounced limp from a childhood accident, and their 2 children, a boy of about 12 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 8. Neighbors would later describe them as quiet, almost eerily so. They kept to themselves, and the children were rarely seen playing outside despite the large, overgrown yard that surrounded the property. The house itself was an imposing 2-story structure, built in the Victorian style with dark wood siding that had weathered to an almost black color over the decades. There was something about its architecture that seemed deliberately unwelcoming, windows that reflected the sky like blind eyes, a porch that sagged in the middle as if exhausted by the weight of whatever secrets it held, and a front door that neighbors swore was never quite in the same position when you looked at it twice. Old Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down, told police later that she'd felt uneasy about the place from the moment the Hartfield family moved in. There was something wrong with that house, she'd insist, wringing her arthritic hands. Sometimes late at night, I'd see lights on in rooms that I could have sworn were empty. And the sounds, dear God, the sounds that came from that place. But it wasn't until that night in October, the 23rd to be precise, that the Blackwood House would transform from merely unsettling to genuinely terrifying. The call. The emergency call came in at 2:47 a.m. on October 24, 1983. Marcus, who was on night shift duty at the precinct, remembered the call dispatcher's face going pale as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. "There's something wrong with this one," she'd said, gesturing for the shift supervisor to pick up. "Real wrong." The voice on the phone was described in the official report as indeterminate gender and age. It spoke in a flat, emotionless monotone that several officers later said reminded them of a recording being played backward. The message was chilling in its simplicity. "I have killed them. All of them. Come to the Blackwood House on Riverside Drive. Come now before it's too late. Then the line went dead. Standard procedure would have been to attempt a callback, to verify the address, to deploy units with extreme caution given the possibility of a trap. But something about that call, something in the way those words had been delivered, with that unnatural, almost mechanical cadence, spurred immediate action. Marcus was part of the initial response team, along with two veteran detectives. James Crawford, a grizzled 25-year veteran who'd seen everything from mob hits to serial killings, and a younger detective named Robert Chin, who'd been with the force for about 5 years and had earned a reputation for his analytical mind and unshakable composure. They arrived at the Blackwood House at 3:13 a.m. Marcus would later say that the moment he stepped out of the patrol car, he felt it, a wrongness that had nothing to do with the decrepit state of the property or the knowledge that they were potentially walking into a murder scene. It was something more primal, a sensation that every instinct developed over millions of years of evolution was screaming at him to get back in the car and drive away. The house loomed before them in the darkness, its windows black and empty. A pale mist had rolled in from the nearby river, clinging to the ground and swirling around their ankles as they approached the front gate. The air smelled wrong, not just the usual urban mixture of exhaust and decay, but something else. Something organic and corrupt, like meat left too long in the sun. "Jesus," Chin muttered, drawing his service weapon. "You guys feel that?" Crawford nodded grimly. He'd drawn his gun too, though his hand was steadier. 25 years on the force and I've never felt anything like this. "Stay sharp, both of you." They called out as they entered the property, identifying themselves as police, ordering anyone inside to come out with their hands visible. Their voices seemed to die in the misty air, absorbed by something that ate sound the way darkness eats light. The yard was overgrown, filled with weeds that had grown waist-high. A rusted swing set stood in one corner, its chains creaking despite the lack of wind. As they moved closer to the house, Marcus noticed something odd about the vegetation. The weeds weren't just dead or dying, they were twisted, growing in strange, spiral patterns that hurt to look at directly. The front door was closed but not locked. Crawford tested it carefully, then pushed it open with his foot, weapon raised. What greeted them was darkness so complete it seemed almost solid, as if the house itself was exhaling shadow. Marcus fumbled for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, Chin grabbed his arm. "Wait," the younger detective whispered. "Listen." From somewhere inside the house came a sound, faint at first but growing gradually louder. It was laughter. Children's laughter. But there was something wrong with it, something that made Marcus's skin crawl. The pitch was off, the rhythm irregular, and underneath it all was a wet, gurgling quality that suggested mouths full of liquid. "Police!" Crawford shouted again, his voice cracking slightly. "Come out now with your hands up." The laughter stopped abruptly, cut off as if by a switch. In the sudden silence, they could hear something else, a slow, rhythmic dripping sound like a leaky faucet. Drip, drip, drip. They entered the house. The first scene. Marcus would later tell me that the moment he crossed the threshold of the Blackwood House, he felt as if he'd passed through some invisible membrane into a place that operated under different rules. The air inside was thick and humid despite the cool October night outside, and it carried that same wrong smell they detected in the yard, but stronger, much stronger. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow hallway with peeling wallpaper and a staircase that ascended into shadows. To their left was what appeared to be a parlor or sitting room, and it was from this direction that the dripping sound emanated. Crawford motioned for them to follow him toward the sound. They moved slowly, weapons and flashlights trained forward, their training warring with instincts that screamed for them to flee. When they reached the doorway to the sitting room, all three men stopped dead. The room was ankle-deep in blood. Not pooled in one area, not splattered on the walls or furniture. The entire floor was covered in a layer of dark, viscous liquid that reflected their flashlight beams with an oily sheen. The dripping sound came from the ceiling, where blood was seeping through the plaster and falling in a steady rhythm into the sea below. "Holy Mother of God," Chin breathed, his weapon wavering. Marcus forced himself to step into the room, feeling the blood creep over his shoes and soak into his socks. It was still warm. The forensic part of his brain, the part trained to observe and document, noted that detail even as the rest of him wanted to vomit. The blood was fresh, hours old at most. Crawford was already on his radio, calling for backup and forensic teams. His voice was steady, professional, but Marcus could see the white-knuckled grip he had on his flashlight. The veteran detective swept his beam around the room, cataloging the scene with an experienced eye. "No bodies," he said quietly. "No visible wounds on the walls or furniture. No signs of struggle. Just blood." "How much blood is this?" Marcus asked, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. Chin knelt at the edge of the pool, careful not to contaminate the scene any further than they already had. "I did some work with forensics before moving to homicide," he said, his analytical mind clearly trying to impose order on the chaos. "Based on the volume and depth, I'd estimate this is at least 6, maybe 7 people's worth of blood. Complete exsanguination of multiple victims." "But where are the bodies?" Marcus pressed. That was the question that would haunt them all. Where were the bodies? Where was the family that had lived here? Where was the person who had called 911 to confess to murder? They continued their search of the house, moving carefully, documenting everything. The other rooms on the ground floor were empty but showed signs of recent habitation. Dishes in the sink, clothes in the bedrooms, children's toys scattered on the floor of what appeared to be a nursery. Everything suggested a family that had been living here up until very recently, a family that had vanished completely, leaving behind only an impossible amount of their blood. The second floor was locked. The door at the top of the stairs was solid oak, and it had been secured from the inside with what sounded like multiple deadbolts. Crawford knocked, shouted the standard warnings, but received no response. Whatever was up there, if anything, wasn't coming out voluntarily. Backup arrived at 4:30 a.m., more detectives, forensic teams, and the medical examiner. The house was declared a crime scene and sealed off. Yellow tape went up, neighbors were interviewed, those few who would answer their doors at that hour, and the grim work of processing the scene began. The medical examiner, a woman named Dr. Sarah Reeves who'd worked with the department for over a decade, examined the blood in the sitting room. Her preliminary assessment confirmed Chen's estimate. Based on volume alone, this represented the complete blood supply of at least 6 adult humans. The problem was that forensic analysis would later reveal something impossible. The blood all came from the same 4 individuals. 4 people. 6 people's worth of blood. The math didn't add up, but the science didn't lie. As dawn broke and the forensic team continued their work, Marcus stood outside the house, smoking a cigarette despite having quit 2 years earlier. Crawford joined him, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. "In all my years," the veteran detective finally said, "I've never seen anything like this. Not even close." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "I don't like it," Crawford continued. "Something about this house, this whole situation, it feels wrong on a fundamental level. Like we're not just investigating a crime scene. Like we're standing on the edge of something we don't understand and shouldn't try to." Those words would prove to be more prophetic than either man could have imagined. The search. Over the following weeks, the investigation into the Blackwood House incident consumed the entire homicide division. The case was officially classified as a quadruple homicide based on the forensic evidence, though the absence of bodies made it unusual, to say the least. The family, Lincoln Hartfield, his wife Catherine, and their 2 children Michael and Emma, had vanished without a trace. Their bank accounts hadn't been touched. Their car was still parked in the garage. Their personal belongings remained in the house. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Background checks on Lincoln Hartfield revealed a troubling history. The man had no employment records going back more than 5 years. Before that, he seemed to appear out of nowhere with no paper trail, no credit history, no records at all. Even more disturbing was what Marcus discovered when he dug deeper. There had been 2 other men named Lincoln Hartfield, both in the same general region, one in the 1950s and another in the 1920s. Neither of these men had any recorded deaths, and photographs from the era, grainy and damaged though they were, showed a striking resemblance to the current Lincoln Hartfield. The house was searched repeatedly, with increasingly sophisticated equipment. Infrared cameras, ground-penetrating radar, even specialized dogs trained to detect human remains. Nothing was found. No hidden rooms, no secret passages, no graves in the yard or basement. The house gave up none of its secrets. But the neighbors had stories. Mrs. Henderson told investigators about hearing children's laughter coming from the house late at night, weeks after it had been sealed as a crime scene. She'd see lights on in the second-floor windows, flickering like candlelight, even though the power had been shut off. Mr. Rodriguez, who delivered mail to the neighborhood, reported that he'd seen figures moving past the windows on multiple occasions, always in his peripheral vision. When he looked directly at the house, it appeared empty and dark. A teenage girl who lived across the street claimed she'd been dared by her friends to sneak up to the house one night. She got as far as the front porch before she said she felt something watching her from inside, not through the windows but through the walls themselves, as if the house had become aware of her presence. She ran home and refused to go near the property again. These reports were dismissed by most of the department as hysteria or attention-seeking, the kind of thing that happens when a sensational crime occurs in a quiet neighborhood. But Marcus, Crawford, and Chin couldn't dismiss them so easily. They'd felt it too, that sense of wrongness, of presence, that seemed to emanate from the Blackwood House like radiation from a toxic source. 6 weeks after the initial incident, with the case growing cold and pressure mounting from the mayor's office to produce results, the decision was made to conduct one more thorough search of the property. This time they would go in at night when the reported phenomena were most active. Marcus volunteered immediately. So did Crawford and Chin. Looking back, Marcus would say this was the moment when his fate was sealed, when he took the first step down a path that would consume the next decade of his life and shatter everything he thought he knew about reality. The second visit, the night of November 30th, 1983, was cold and clear. A full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the riverside neighborhood. The team assembled at 11 p.m. Marcus, Crawford, Chin, and 3 uniformed officers who would maintain a perimeter around the house. They'd been briefed on the reported phenomena and instructed to document anything unusual. Marcus carried a handheld video camera in addition to his standard equipment, one of the new portable models that the department had recently acquired. He'd insisted on it despite the eye rolls from some of his colleagues. The house looked different at night. The shadows seemed deeper, more solid. The windows reflected the moonlight in ways that almost looked like faces, anguished, screaming faces pressed against the glass from inside. Everyone sees that, right? Chin asked quietly, pointing at one of the second-floor windows. They all saw it, and they all told themselves it was a trick of the light, a pattern recognition error in the human brain, anything but what it appeared to be. The front door was still sealed with police tape. Crawford broke the seal and pushed it open. The smell that emerged was indescribable, not decomposition exactly, but something chemical and organic at the same time, like formaldehyde mixed with rotting flowers. They entered with flashlights blazing, calling out again, knowing it was pointless but following procedure anyway. The house was exactly as they'd left it, except for one crucial detail. The blood was gone. The sitting room, which had been ankle-deep in blood 6 weeks earlier, was completely clean. Not just clean, pristine. The wooden floorboards shone as if freshly polished. There wasn't a drop, a stain, a spatter anywhere. "This is impossible," Chin said, his voice rising slightly. "We documented everything. We took samples. There were photographs, video evidence. It was real." Crawford was already on his radio, calling it in to the officers outside. But even as he spoke, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The sitting room looked different in another way. The furniture had been rearranged. Not dramatically, but subtly. A chair moved a few inches to the left, a table rotated slightly. It was the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't intimately familiar with the crime scene, but Marcus had spent hours in this room documenting every detail. "Guys," he said slowly, "something's wrong with the layout." Before they could investigate further, they heard it, the same sound from their first visit. Children's laughter, high and bright, coming from the second floor. But this time it was accompanied by something else. Music. Faint and tinny, like an old phonograph playing somewhere in the house. The melody was archaic, something from the 1920s or 30s, and underneath the music was a rhythmic thumping sound, as if people were dancing overhead. The 3 detectives looked at each other. Training and instinct were at war with a growing sense of dread that had no rational basis. "We go up," Crawford said finally. His voice was steady, but Marcus could see the fear in his eyes. "But we stay together. Nobody goes off alone." "Understood." They nodded and moved toward the stairs. The staircase seemed longer than Marcus remembered, each step creaking under their weight despite the house being structurally sound. The music grew louder as they climbed, and now they could distinguish voices, adult voices speaking in low, urgent tones. There was laughter too, not just children's laughter but the deeper, rougher sound of adult amusement. Crawford reached the top of the stairs first. He stopped so abruptly that Marcus almost walked into him. The veteran detective's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with an expression Marcus had never seen on him before. Absolute terror. "Crawford," Chin whispered. "What is it? What do you see?" Before Crawford could answer, something grabbed Chin from behind. Marcus spun around just in time to see his colleague's feet disappear around the landing at the bottom of the stairs, dragged by something that moved with impossible speed. Chin's scream was cut off abruptly, leaving only an echoing silence. "Chin!" Marcus shouted, starting back down the stairs, but Crawford grabbed his arm. "Don't," the older detective gasped. We have to see what's up here first." Marcus wanted to argue, but something in Crawford's voice stopped him. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something deeper, more primal. It was the tone of a man who had glimpsed something so far beyond his understanding that fear had become inadequate. Against every instinct, Marcus turned back to the second floor. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room that shouldn't exist. The second floor of the Blackwood House had been laid out in a conventional manner during their first investigation. A hallway with 4 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a linen closet. Marcus had walked this floor multiple times, had searched every room, had memorized the layout. That's not what he saw now. The walls were gone. The entire second floor had become one vast open space, like a ballroom or banquet hall. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, higher than the roof of the house should allow, and was decorated with elaborate crown molding and a massive crystal chandelier that blazed with hundreds of candles despite the house having no power. The floor was covered with an ornate Persian rug that looked both ancient and pristine. In the center of the room stood a long dining table, set for what appeared to be a formal dinner party. The table was laden with food, roasted meats, elaborate desserts, fruits and vegetables arranged in artistic displays. Crystal glasses gleamed in the candlelight, and fine china plates were set at each place. But it was what was at the far end of the table that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. A pale, slender arm hung over the edge of the table, so white it almost seemed to glow in the candlelight. Blood dripped slowly from the fingertips, falling into a crystal bowl placed on the floor beneath it. Drip, drip, drip. The same sound they'd heard on their first visit. Around the table, figures moved in the shadows. Marcus couldn't see them clearly, they seemed to exist in the gaps between candlelight and darkness, flickering in and out of visibility. But he could hear them, the clink of silverware on china, the murmur of conversation, occasional laughter. "This isn't real," Crawford whispered beside him. "This can't be real." But it felt real. More than real, it felt hyper-real, as if this dining room, this impossible space, was somehow more authentic than the mundane world they'd left behind. One of the shadow figures turned toward them. Marcus couldn't make out any features, but he felt its attention lock onto him like a physical weight. The conversations around the table stopped. All the shadow figures were turning now, all focusing on the 2 intruders. "We need to leave," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "Now." But Crawford wasn't moving. The veteran detective stood transfixed, staring at something Marcus couldn't see. "It's him," Crawford breathed. "At the head of the table. It's Lincoln Hartfield. But he's wrong. So wrong." Marcus forced himself to look. At the head of the table, barely visible in the flickering light, sat a figure in formal evening wear. Where its face should have been was a darkness so complete that looking at it made Marcus's eyes water and his head swim. The music swelled suddenly, the phonograph sound becoming overwhelming, distorted. The shadow figures began to move, standing from their chairs and advancing toward the 2 detectives. Marcus grabbed Crawford's arm and pulled, but the older man seemed rooted to the spot. "Crawford, we have to go." The lights went out. In that moment of absolute darkness, Marcus felt something brush past him, something cold and wrong that made his skin crawl where it touched him. He heard Crawford gasp, heard footsteps, too many footsteps, surrounding them. The laughter returned, but now it was everywhere, coming from all directions at once, building to a crescendo that made his ears ring and his vision blur. And then, the lost time. Marcus woke up on the floor of the first-story sitting room. His head throbbed with the worst headache of his life, and his mouth tasted like copper. Sunlight streamed through the windows, indicating it was well past dawn. Sitting up slowly, he saw Crawford lying nearby, also unconscious. As Marcus struggled to his feet, the older detective groaned and began to stir. What happened? Crawford mumbled, pressing a hand to his temple. Marcus looked around the room. Everything was as it had been during their first visit. The furniture in its original positions, the walls covered in water stains and peeling wallpaper. There was no blood on the floor, but there never had been on this visit. What disturbed him was that he couldn't remember how they'd gotten here. The last thing he remembered clearly was standing at the top of the stairs, looking into that impossible ballroom. Everything after that was a blur of sensations and images that didn't quite fit together. Darkness, cold, the feeling of falling, whispered words in a language he didn't recognize. "We need to check the second floor," Marcus said, helping Crawford to his feet. "We need to see." But he already knew what they would find. The second floor had returned to its normal layout: 4 bedrooms, a bathroom, a linen closet. No ballroom. No dining table. No impossibly high ceilings or crystal chandelier. The rooms were dusty and empty, exactly as they'd been during the initial investigation. There was no sign of the arm hanging over the table edge. No blood in the crystal bowl. No shadow figures. And no Detective Robert Chin. The search for Chin. The department launched a massive search for Detective Chin, treating it as an officer in distress situation. Every available unit combed the neighborhood. Dive teams searched the nearby river. Search and rescue dogs tracked his scent as far as the Blackwood House and then lost it completely, as if Chin had simply vanished into thin air at the property line. Marcus and Crawford were questioned extensively. Their stories matched perfectly up to the point where Chin was grabbed and dragged away. Neither man could explain what happened after that. They both mentioned the impossible ballroom on the second floor, the dining table, the shadow figures. The department psychiatrist was brought in. Marcus and Crawford were examined for signs of trauma, stress, possible hallucination due to carbon monoxide or other environmental factors. The house was tested for gas leaks, mold, anything that might cause shared delusions. Nothing was found. The case officially listed Detective Robert Chin as missing in the line of duty, presumed dead after 6 months with no leads. His name would eventually be added to the memorial wall at the precinct, though no body was ever recovered and no death certificate was ever issued. Crawford retired shortly after, despite being years away from his planned retirement age. The once confident veteran became withdrawn and nervous, jumping at shadows and refusing to discuss the Blackwood House incident with anyone. Marcus visited him a few times, but Crawford would always change the subject, his eyes holding a haunted quality that Marcus recognized all too well. As for Marcus himself, he became obsessed. The official investigation might have been closed, but he couldn't let it go. Chin had been his partner, his friend. The man had a wife, 2 kids. They deserved answers, even if those answers defied everything Marcus had been trained to believe. He began conducting his own investigation in his off hours, following leads that the department had dismissed as irrelevant or impossible. He delved into the history of the Blackwood House, of the Hartfield family, and of Lincoln Hartfield in particular. What he found would only deepen the mystery. The pattern emerges. Marcus's investigation uncovered a disturbing pattern. Lincoln Hartfield, it seemed, had lived multiple lives under the same name. Through painstaking research in county archives, libraries, and old newspaper records, Marcus found evidence of at least 3 different Lincoln Hartfields, all connected to the same geographic area. Lincoln Hartfield I, 1888, disappeared 1929, an industrialist who'd made a fortune in manufacturing before losing everything in the Great Depression. Records showed he'd been involved with several esoteric societies and had spent considerable time traveling to remote regions of Asia and South America. He'd disappeared shortly before the stock market crash, and his body was never found. Lincoln Hartfield II, 1925, disappeared 1956, officially listed as the son of the first Hartfield, though birth records were suspiciously vague. This Hartfield had been investigated by authorities in connection with several disappearances in the 1940s and 50s, but no charges were ever filed. He'd worked as a spiritual consultant, and was known to have connections to various fringe religious groups. Like his supposed father, he disappeared without a trace. Lincoln Hartfield III, 1960, disappeared 1983, the man who'd lived in the Blackwood House with his family. Birth records listed his parents as deceased, with no further information available. The few photographs Marcus could find showed a disturbing resemblance between all 3 Lincoln Hartfields, Not the natural similarity between father, son, and grandson, but something more unsettling. They looked like the same person at different ages. Even more disturbing was what Marcus discovered about the pattern of disappearances associated with each Hartfield. Every few decades, people would vanish in the areas where a Lincoln Hartfield lived. Not enough to trigger a major investigation, but enough to form a pattern if you knew to look for one. Children mostly, but also adults. They would disappear without a trace and the cases would go cold. Marcus found references to something called the Path of Ascension in some of the older documents, cryptic mentions in the personal papers of the first Lincoln Hartfield, which had been donated to a university library after his disappearance. The few passages Marcus could decipher suggested Hartfield believed in a form of spiritual immortality that required specific rituals and sacrifices. He was chasing leads related to one of these references, something about a mental institution where the first Hartfield had allegedly sent an associate, when the pattern he'd been following for years suddenly resolved into terrifying clarity. The circle closes. It was 1993. Marcus had been investigating the Blackwood House case for 10 years, though officially the case had been closed as unsolved for nearly a decade. His obsession had cost him his marriage, several friendships, and probably any chance at advancement in the department. But he couldn't stop. Every lead, no matter how thin, had to be followed. The mental institution was in the northern part of the state, a sprawling Victorian-era complex that had been converted into a modern psychiatric hospital but still retained the bones of its original architecture. Marcus had learned that a man named Frederick Whitmore, who'd been an associate of the first Lincoln Hartfield, had been committed there in 1928 after claiming to have witnessed rituals that defied natural law. Whitmore had died in 1962, but the hospital maintained archives of patient records. After considerable legal wrangling and the use of some personal connections, Marcus was granted access to Whitmore's files. What he read there confirmed his worst suspicions. Whitmore described in detail a series of rituals Hartfield had performed, claiming they were designed to achieve transcendence of the mortal form. The rituals allegedly required the willing participation of family members and the creation of what Whitmore called anchor points, physical locations that existed simultaneously in multiple states of reality. The Blackwood House, Whitmore claimed, was one such anchor point. Hartfield had performed the first ritual there in 1928, just before his disappearance. The ritual required the complete exsanguination of his family, their blood used to paint doors between worlds. Marcus read these accounts with a mixture of professional skepticism and growing horror. On paper it sounded like the ravings of a madman. But he'd seen what he'd seen. He'd stood in that impossible ballroom. He'd watched his partner vanish into darkness. He left the hospital late that evening, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd learned. The drive back to the city took him through a stretch of dense forest, a shortcut he'd taken dozens of times before. But that night, something was different. About halfway through the forest, Marcus noticed that the road seemed wrong. The trees were denser than usual, their branches meeting overhead to block out the moonlight. The headlights of his car seemed dimmer, struggling to push back the darkness. And then, impossibly, the road curved to the left when he knew for certain it should run straight for another mile. Marcus felt a sudden chill run through him. He slowed the car, his hands gripping the wheels so tightly his knuckles went white. The trees were moving now, not swaying in the wind but actually moving, sliding past his peripheral vision like dancers in a slow waltz. He blinked, and when his eyes opened again, he wasn't in his car anymore. He was standing at the bottom of a staircase, the Blackwood House staircase, and he could hear voices from the second floor. Crawford's voice, his own voice, saying words he remembered speaking 10 years ago. "This isn't real," Marcus said aloud, but his voice sounded distant, muffled, as if he were speaking through water. But it felt real. He could smell that same wrong smell, chemicals and rot. He could feel the worn wood of the banister under his hand. He could hear Chen's footsteps behind him. Chen, who had vanished 10 years ago. Marcus turned around and there he was, Robert Chen, looking exactly as he had that night, weapon drawn, face set in an expression of professional concern. "You ready for this?" Chen asked. And Marcus understood with sudden, crystalline clarity what was happening. This wasn't a memory. This wasn't a hallucination. He had somehow been pulled back in time, or time had been pulled back around him, to that night in November 1983. He had a choice. He could warn Chen, could prevent what was about to happen. Or he could let events unfold as they must, to maintain the timeline that had led him to this moment of understanding. Before he could decide, Crawford's voice called down from the top of the stairs, "Marcus, Chin, get up here. You need to see this." Marcus looked at Chin, seeing his partner, his friend, alive and whole for what might be the last time. Every instinct screamed at him to grab Chin and run, to get out of this house before the darkness could claim him. But something deeper, some understanding that existed beyond conscious thought, told him that this moment was inevitable, that it had already happened and would always happen, a fixed point in a reality that was far more fluid than he'd ever imagined. "After you," Marcus heard himself say, the words coming out automatically, exactly as they had 10 years ago. They climbed the stairs together. Marcus's mind was racing, trying to reconcile what was happening. Was this time travel? A hallucination? Some kind of psychotic break brought on by a decade of obsession? But everything felt too real, too visceral. The creak of the stairs under his feet, the weight of his service weapon in his hand, the sound of Chen's breathing beside him. All of it was exactly as he remembered. They reached the landing. Crawford stood at the top, his face pale in the beam of his flashlight, staring at something Marcus couldn't yet see. This was the moment, the exact moment, when everything would change. Marcus opened his mouth to shout a warning, but no sound came out. He tried to reach for Chen to pull him back, but his arms wouldn't respond. He was locked in place, a passenger in his own body, forced to watch events unfold exactly as they had a decade before. Chen stepped past him. The shadow moved from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, that same impossible shadow that moved too fast and too smoothly to be human. Marcus saw Chen's eyes widen, saw him try to turn, try to bring his weapon around. But the shadow was already on him, wrapping around him like liquid darkness, and then both Chen and the shadow were gone, vanished as if they'd never existed. Chen. Past Marcus shouted, and present Marcus felt the word torn from his throat even though he hadn't consciously chosen to speak it. He was being pulled forward now, moving toward Crawford at the top of the stairs. He knew what came next. He would see the impossible ballroom, the dining table, the pale arm hanging over the edge. He would see the shadow figures and the thing that sat at the head of the table wearing Lincoln Hartfield's shape like an ill-fitting suit. But this time, armed with 10 years of investigation and understanding, Marcus could see more. He could see the layers beneath the illusion, the way reality bent and folded around the Blackwood house like fabric caught in a drain. He could see that the ballroom wasn't just a different room, it was a different time, a different iteration of the house overlaid on top of the present like a photographic double exposure. The chandelier blazed with light that came from no earthly source. The shadow figures at the table were more distinct now, and Marcus recognized them with a jolt of horror. They were the missing people, all the disappeared children and adults from across the decades. They sat frozen at the table, not eating, not moving, just staring with empty eyes at some point in the middle distance. And at the head of the table sat Lincoln Hartfield, but it wasn't just one Hartfield. Marcus could see all three of them occupying the same space, flickering between iterations like a malfunctioning film projector. Young Hartfield, middle-aged Hartfield, old Hartfield, all existing simultaneously in a single body that couldn't quite maintain coherence. The thing wearing Hartfield's face turned to look at Marcus, and he saw nothing where its eyes should be, just darkness that stretched back forever, a void that preceded existence itself. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in Marcus's bones and teeth. "You've come back," it said, and Marcus realized with dawning horror that it had known he would return, that it had been waiting for this moment for 10 years. "You've finally begun to understand." Marcus tried to speak, but Crawford's hand was on his arm now, pulling him back, saying words Marcus remembered hearing but hadn't understood at the time. "We have to go. We have to see what's up here first." No, Marcus wanted to scream. "We have to save Chin. We have to run." But his body betrayed him, turning to face the second floor, and he understood that he was trapped in the past's gravity, pulled along by events that had already occurred. The Hartfield thing stood, and as it rose, reality around it began to warp and stretch. The ballroom started to collapse in on itself, the walls folding like origami, the shadow figures beginning to scream, horrible, anguished screams that sounded like they'd been building for decades. The chandelier shattered, but instead of glass falling, the fragments hung suspended in the air, catching light that no longer existed and casting reflections of scenes that Marcus recognized. Other nights, other victims, other moments when the veil between worlds had grown thin. In one fragment, Marcus saw the first Hartfield performing some kind of ritual in a basement, surrounded by symbols drawn in blood. In another, he saw the second Hartfield leading a group of hooded figures in a ceremony in what looked like the same ballroom they were standing in now. In a third, he saw himself, older, grayer, standing in this exact spot, looking back at his younger self with an expression of profound sorrow. The path of ascension, the Hartfield thing said, moving toward them with footsteps that echoed wrong, leaving footprints that glowed with a sickly phosphorescence. Do you know what it means to transcend mortality? To exist outside the boundaries of linear time? I have achieved what mystics and philosophers have only dreamed of. I am eternal. I am inevitable. I am. The lights went out. Marcus felt that same cold presence brush past him in the darkness, felt the same disorientation and vertigo. But this time, with his decade of knowledge and understanding, he could sense what was happening. The house wasn't just a building, it was a machine, a device constructed over generations to tear holes in reality itself. Each Hartfield had been the same entity, using the blood of his family as fuel to restart the cycle, to anchor itself more firmly in the spaces between moments. And Chin. Poor Chin had been taken not as a victim but as a component, his life force used to power another iteration of the machine, to ensure that the cycle would continue. Marcus tried to fight against the pull to maintain consciousness, but the darkness was too strong. He felt himself falling, tumbling through layers of time and space that folded in on themselves like a Klein bottle. He caught glimpses of other moments, other versions of the Blackwood House existing in different eras. The house in the 1920s, pristine and new. The house in the 1950s, its rooms filled with furniture that had gone out of style. The house in the 1980s, exactly as he'd first seen it. And the house in other times he didn't recognize, decayed beyond recognition or rebuilt into strange new configurations. When he finally hit bottom, if bottom was even the right word for where he ended up, Marcus found himself lying on the floor of the first-story sitting room. But it was different now. The blood was back, ankle-deep, still warm. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the pale light of dawn, was Crawford. But not the Crawford from 1983. This was Crawford from the present, 10 years older, face haggard and worn. He looked down at Marcus with eyes that held no surprise, only a terrible resignation. "You're back," Crawford said softly. "I'd hoped you wouldn't be, but I knew you would. It always happens this way." Marcus struggled to sit up, the blood soaking through his clothes. "What are you talking about? What is this?" Crawford knelt down beside him, and Marcus could see that his former partner had aged badly. Deep lines creased his face, and his hands trembled with a slight palsy. "I remember this morning," Crawford said. "November 30th, 1983. We woke up in this room and Chin was gone. But that's not the whole truth, is it? That's just what we told ourselves, what we needed to believe to stay sane." "Crawford, I don't understand." "The house shows you what you need to see," Crawford interrupted. "It shows you your own investigation, your own obsession played out across 10 years. But the truth is simpler and more horrible than that. We never left, Marcus. We've been here the entire time, living the same night over and over, thinking we were investigating, thinking we were free. But we're just like the others, the shadow figures at the table. We're part of the house now." Marcus felt ice water in his veins. "No, that's not true. I have 10 years of memories. I remember cases, conversations, evidence I found." "Do you?" Crawford's voice was gentle, almost pitying. "Or do you remember the house showing you those things? Think about it. Really think. Can you remember leaving this house? Can you remember any moment that doesn't somehow lead back here?" Marcus tried. He tried to remember his apartment, his office at the precinct, the faces of other detectives he'd worked with over the past decade. But the memories were fuzzy, indistinct, like photographs left too long in the sun. The only thing that felt real, that felt solid and true, was the Blackwood House. The investigation. The obsession. "Oh God," Marcus whispered. "Oh God, no. The house feeds on us," Crawford continued. "On our determination, our need to solve the mystery, our refusal to accept defeat. That's what keeps us here, keeps us powering the machine. Hartfield, or whatever he's become, he doesn't just need blood. He needs purpose, intention, life force directed with unwavering focus. And what better source than detectives who can't let go of a case?" Marcus looked around the room, seeing it with new eyes. The blood on the floor, Was it even real? Or was it just another illusion, another layer of the trap? He could feel his sense of reality crumbling, everything he'd thought he'd known dissolving like sugar in water. There has to be a way out, he said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. There has to be. There is, said a new voice. Marcus turned to see Chin standing in the doorway. But it wasn't the Chin who'd been dragged away by shadows, and it wasn't the Chin he'd just lived through that moment with. This was a different Chin, older like Crawford but somehow more present, more real. His eyes held a clarity that the others lacked. Chin. Marcus breathed. You're alive? Alive, dead. Those are words for a world that makes sense, Chin said, stepping into the room. His feet didn't disturb the blood. He walked on top of it as if it were solid ground. I've been in the deep places of this house, Marcus. The parts where time doesn't flow in one direction. I've seen what Hartfield is building, what he's trying to become. And I've found the flaw in his design. Crawford stood up, and Marcus saw something change in his former partner's expression. Hope, maybe, or just the ghost of it. Tell us. Chin moved to the center of the room, and as he walked, Marcus noticed that his shadow moved independently, falling in directions that had nothing to do with the light sources. The house is a machine, yes, but it's also a prison, for Hartfield as much as for us. He's trapped himself in his own design, existing between moments but unable to fully enter any of them. He needs us to anchor him, to give him purpose and reality. Without us, he's just potential energy with nowhere to go. So we just let go? Marcus asked. Stop investigating? Stop trying to solve the case. It's harder than that, Chin said. Because part of us is real, Marcus. Part of what we've experienced actually happened. We did enter this house in 1983. We did encounter something impossible. And one of us, the real version of one of us, did get lost here. The trick is figuring out which one. Marcus felt his mind starting to fracture under the weight of this revelation. That doesn't make any sense. How can we be both real and not real? Because the house exists in superposition, Chin explained, and now Marcus could see that his partner's form was flickering slightly, as if he were a hologram with a bad connection. It's simultaneously the site of a crime and a portal to something else. We're simultaneously investigating and being investigated, hunting and being hunted. Schrodinger's detectives. Crawford laughed, but there was no humor in it. So what do? We have to accept the paradox, Chin said. We have to exist in two states simultaneously. We have to acknowledge that we're trapped while simultaneously believing that we're free. We have to investigate the case while accepting that the case is unsolvable. We have to. A sound from above cut him off. That familiar laughter, those running footsteps. But there was something different about them now, something more frantic, more desperate. He knows what I'm telling you, Chin said urgently. The house, Hartfield, whatever it is, it's trying to reset again, to pull us back into the loop. You have to resist. You have to hold on to the contradiction, the impossibility of it all. That's the only weapon we have against something that exists outside normal logic. The lights began to flicker. The blood on the floor started to move, swirling into patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric shapes that existed in more than 3 dimensions, symbols that predated human language. The walls were breathing now, expanding and contracting like lungs, and Marcus could hear whispers in the spaces between heartbeats. Remember this moment, Chin said, his voice becoming distant, echoing. Remember that you figured it out. Remember that you understood. And when you wake up, because you will wake up, Marcus, you'll wake up over and over again. Remember that you have a choice. You can accept the loop or you can break it. But breaking it means accepting something worse than being trapped. What could be worse than this? Marcus shouted over the growing cacophony of sounds, the laughter, the music, the whispers, all blending into a symphony of madness. Chin smiled, and it was the saddest smile Marcus had ever seen. Freedom. Because if we break the loop, if we escape the house, we have to accept that the version of us that stays behind was real. That it's still here, still trapped, experiencing this moment forever. We have to abandon ourselves to save ourselves. We have to become Hartfield, or at least understand why he chose to become what he is. The floor gave way beneath Marcus's feet. The awakening. Marcus woke up in his car, pulled over on the side of the forest road. His heart was pounding and he was drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. He checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. He'd been driving back from the mental institution, from his conversation with the archives about Frederick Whitmore. But something was different. He could feel it. The memories of the time loop, of Crawford's revelation and Chen's explanation, they were still there, vivid and real. Usually when he had flashbacks to that night in 1983, they felt distant, like remembering a movie he'd once seen. But this felt immediate, present, true. Marcus got out of the car and looked around. The forest was just a forest, dark and quiet, yes, but fundamentally normal. No moving trees, no impossible curves in the road. Whatever had happened, however he'd gotten pulled back into that night, he'd broken free of it. Or had he? A terrible thought occurred to him. What if this was just another layer of the loop? What if the house's final trap was to make him think he'd escaped, to give him a false sense of freedom that was really just another, more subtle prison? He pulled out his cell phone, a new technology relatively speaking that hadn't existed in 1983, and dialed Crawford's number. The veteran detective had retired years ago and rarely answered unknown calls at this hour, but Marcus had to know. He had to verify that this reality was real. The phone rang 4 times before Crawford's groggy voice answered. "This better be important." "Crawford, it's Marcus. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." There was a pause, then Crawford's voice came back, clearer now, tinged with concern. "Marcus? What's wrong? Are you okay?" "The Blackwood House," Marcus said. "The night Chen disappeared. Do you remember it?" Another pause, longer this time. "Of course I remember it. Why are you asking me this?" "Marcus, have you been drinking? Tell me what you remember. Every detail." Crawford sighed, but he complied. As he spoke, describing the events of that night, Marcus listened carefully for any discrepancies, any signs that this conversation was just another illusion. But Crawford's account matched his own memories, not the looped version he'd just experienced, but the original events as they'd actually occurred. "And after we woke up on the first floor," Crawford continued, "we searched the house again. The second floor was normal, just bedrooms and a bathroom. No ballroom, no dining table. Nothing out of the ordinary. We called it in and launched a search for Chen and, well, you know the rest. Do you ever think about it?" Marcus asked quietly. "Do you ever wonder if what we saw was real?" Crawford was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "Every day. Every single day for 10 years. But Marcus, you have to let it go. Whatever was in that house, whatever happened to Chen, we did everything we could. We followed every lead. We exhausted every possibility. Sometimes there are just no answers. But what if there are answers?" Marcus pressed. "What if we just haven't found them yet?" "Then maybe we're not meant to," Crawford said firmly. "Listen to me, Marcus. I'm worried about you. This obsession, it's eating you alive. I've seen it happen before. Good cops who couldn't let go of a case, who let it consume them until there was nothing left. Don't become that. Don't let the Blackwood House take you too." After they hung up, Marcus sat in his car for a long time, thinking about Crawford's words. The old detective was right, of course. The obsession had taken over his life. But could he really let it go? Could he accept that some mysteries might never be solved? He thought about Chen's words in the loop. "We have to abandon ourselves to save ourselves." Maybe that's what Crawford had done. Maybe he'd chosen to let go of the detective who couldn't accept the impossible, to become someone who could live with uncertainty. And maybe that's what Marcus needed to do too. But as he started his car and pulled back onto the road, heading home, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. That somewhere, in some version of reality, he was still standing in the Blackwood House, still experiencing that night in November 1983, still trying to solve a mystery that defied solution. And perhaps, in the end, that was the true horror. Not that he was trapped in a time loop, but that he couldn't tell the difference between the loop and reality. That maybe there was no difference at all. Epilogue: The Return. 6 months later, Marcus stood outside the lot where the Blackwood House had once stood. The property had been developed into a small office park, bland, modern buildings that held no trace of the Gothic horror that had preceded them. It was a bright spring morning and the sun felt warm on his face. He'd come here to make peace with the case, to finally let it go. Crawford's words had stayed with him, and he'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in work-related trauma. Slowly, painfully, he was beginning to rebuild his life beyond the obsession. But he'd needed to come here one last time, to see the place in daylight, stripped of mystery and fear, reduced to its essential ordinariness. As he stood there, a young woman approached him. She was maybe 25, wearing business casual attire and carrying a coffee cup from the shop across the street. "Excuse me," she said. "You're Detective Marcus Chin, aren't you?" Marcus blinked, surprised. "Just Marcus. I'm not with the department anymore. How did you know my name?" The woman smiled, but there was something strange about it, something that made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck stand up. "My father used to tell me stories about this place, about a house that stood here a long time ago, and 3 detectives who investigated something impossible." "Your father?" Marcus asked, his mouth suddenly dry. "Robert Chin," the woman said. "He's my father. Or was, I suppose. It's complicated." Marcus stared at her, his mind reeling. Chin had never had children. Marcus had attended the memorial service, had spoken with Chen's wife. There had been no children. "I don't understand," he managed to say. The woman's smile grew wider, and now Marcus could see the wrongness in it, the way it didn't quite reach her eyes, the way her pupils reflected the sunlight at angles that shouldn't be possible. "Neither do I really. I just know that I exist, that I've always existed, and that the Blackwood House made me possible." She reached out and touched Marcus's arm, and in that instant he saw it all. Chin, alive but not alive, existing in the spaces between the house's iterations, unable to fully return to linear time but also unable to entirely disappear. And this daughter, this impossible person, born from the paradox of his existence. A child who existed because her father both died and didn't die on the same November night. "He wanted me to give you a message," she said. "He said to tell you that the loop can't be broken but it can be understood. That accepting the paradox isn't the same as solving the mystery, it's transcending the need for solutions. That sometimes the only way out is through, and through is forever." Marcus pulled his arm away, stumbling backward. "This isn't real. You're not real." "I'm as real as you are," she said gently. "As real as the house was. As real as that night in November. Reality is more flexible than we like to believe, Detective. The Blackwood House proved that. My father proved that. And you've spent 10 years proving it every day." She turned to walk away, then paused and looked back. "Oh, and Detective? The house is gone, but the space where it stood isn't empty. It's full of echoes, full of might-have-beens and never-weres. Be careful how much time you spend here. The echoes have a way of becoming real if you listen to them long enough." Marcus watched her disappear into the crowd of office workers on their morning break, and he realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that Crawford was right. He had to let it go. He had to walk away from this place and never come back, or he really would be trapped forever. Maybe not in the house itself, but in his own mind, in his own inability to accept that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. He turned and walked back to his car, forcing himself not to look back at the lot where the Blackwood House had stood. But even as he drove away, he could feel it pulling at him, that old obsession, that need to understand, to solve, to make sense of the senseless. And he knew, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that he would be back. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but eventually. The house might be gone, but its gravity remained, pulling him inexorably toward a truth that could never be fully known. That night Marcus had a dream. He was standing in the Blackwood House again, in that impossible ballroom on the 2nd floor. But this time he wasn't afraid. He walked calmly to the dining table where the shadow figures sat frozen in their eternal feast. He took an empty seat at the far end, across from the thing wearing Lincoln Hartfield's face. "I understand now," Marcus said in the dream. "This is the price of certainty in an uncertain world. You wanted to live forever, to exist outside time's arrow. And you achieved it, but the cost was everything that makes existence meaningful. You're not alive and you're not dead. You're just stuck." The Hartfield thing nodded, or perhaps it was just the shadows shifting. "And you, Detective? What will you choose? Will you accept the mystery and move on, or will you sit at this table with us, chasing truth into eternity?" Marcus looked around at the shadow figures, and now he could see their faces clearly. Some were from decades past, others from years he recognized, and still others from times that hadn't happened yet. They were all investigators in their own way, people who'd sought answers in the wrong place, who'd stared too long into the abyss and lost themselves in it. "I choose to live," Marcus said. "With questions. With uncertainty. With the knowledge that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved because the act of solving them would destroy what we're trying to understand. I choose to be human with all the limitations that implies. The Hartfield thing smiled, and for just a moment, Marcus saw something like pride in its empty eyes. Then wake up, detective. And try not to come back. Marcus woke in his bed, sunlight streaming through his window. It was morning. A normal, ordinary morning. And for the first time in 10 years he felt something like peace. But in the back of his mind, he could still hear the echo of children's laughter and the slow, steady drip of blood hitting crystal. And he knew that no matter how far he ran, no matter how completely he tried to move on, a part of him would always be in that house, standing at the top of those stairs, watching his partner vanish into darkness. Some cases, as the old-timers had tried to tell him, are never really closed. They just learn to live with us, in the shadows of our thoughts, waiting for the moment when we're weak enough to pull us back in. Marcus got out of bed and started his day, carrying his impossible knowledge like a scar that had healed but would never truly fade. And somewhere, in a place that existed between memory and reality, the Blackwood House waited, patient and eternal, for the next investigator who would think they could solve its mystery. The cycle would continue. It always did. This story, as Marcus told it to me that night over coffee and rain, may or may not be true. Perhaps it was just a shared delusion between traumatized detectives. Perhaps it was something else entirely. I choose to believe that Marcus escaped, that he found his way back to the real world and built a life beyond his obsession. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles my windows and I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder, if the Blackwood House could create echoes of itself in reality, how many other places might do the same? How many other impossible spaces exist in the gaps between what we know and what we can never truly understand? Marcus moved away the year after telling me this story. He left no forwarding address, and I haven't heard from him since. Sometimes I think about trying to find him to see if he's okay, if he really did escape the gravity of that case. But then I remember what he told me that night, his hands trembling around his coffee cup, his eyes reflecting shadows that shouldn't exist in a well-lit room. Some questions are better left unasked. Some searches are better left unfinished. Because the act of seeking certain truths changes you into something that can perceive them, and you might not like what you become. I think about that a lot. I think about it every time I pass an old house that feels wrong, every time I hear unexplained sounds in the night, every time reality seems to shift just slightly out of phase with itself. And I wonder, are these really just quirks of perception, tricks of the mind, natural phenomena we don't yet understand? Or are they echoes of other Blackwood houses, other places where reality has grown thin, other spaces where the impossible has learned to bleed through into our world? I don't know the answer. Perhaps I never will. Perhaps that's for the best. The end.